I'm Sister Mary Ann Daly, a Sister of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul of New York, and I would love to share with you a story about being evangelized by a person who was poor. Sometimes when we think about being evangelized by those living in poverty, we think of those positive experiences we've had, where the poor have thanked us or been gracious to us. Or sometimes we think of experiences that we've had where, while dealing with someone who lives in poverty, we were struck by their harshness, but we responded out of the best place in ourselves. I'd like to share you a story about someone who was poor and those of us who did not respond wonderfully at first, but who learned who we were and who Jesus was in the process. I worked in a long-term care facility in the heart of an urban city. We had 729 residents, 150 of whom were people suffering from AIDS. The AIDS population were mainly people who had been paroled to us from prison or those who had been chronically homeless. One such person I'm going to call Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards had been a chronically homeless man, addicted to drugs and alcohol. In the facility, he was a quiet man, but not very easy to deal with. One of the problems that Mr. Edwards had was that he had spent so much of his life sleeping on a park bench that he found sleeping in his own bed difficult. So at night, frequently the security guard would find him sound asleep on a bench in the chapel, would wake him up as they were about to lock the chapel at midnight, and ask Mr. Edwards to go to bed. One of these nights, as the security guard tried to awaken Mr. Edwards, he found that he had died in his sleep in the chapel. Mr. Edwards had no family, no friends that we knew of. He had been a Vietnam vet, so we knew that he could be buried, that he wouldn't have to go to Potter's Field. We decided in the facility to have a service for him. Mr. Edwards was not Catholic, so we weren't going to have a mass, but have a memorial service. We posted the message, put it on the board, and got ready for the service. I presumed that a few of Mr. Edwards' fellow patients would come. Instead, the chapel was filled to overflowing with staff, with administrators, with people from back finance offices. It surprised me. During the service, we allowed people to stand and speak of their memory of this man, and one by one they got up. One of the first people to stand was someone who worked in the finance office. She talked about how every day at 10 o'clock they would make coffee in their office. They would make a pot of 6 cups of coffee because there were 5 of them there. Every day as the coffee was brewing, Mr. Edwards would arrive at the door. Finally, after being so frustrated by giving this man some of their coffee, they began to make more. They learned that if they made 7 or 8 cups, there was enough for everyone. She talked about what a revelation it was to them to be able to think in the concepts of more and to learn from him who the residents really were that they were serving, people that they very seldom saw. One of the other persons who spoke was the head of admitting. Her brother had died recently, and as she was walking down the hall, she saw Mr. Edwards and said, "I have sneakers from my brother that I'll bring in tomorrow. I think they might fit you." When she brought them in, she gave them to Mr. Edwards. He looked at her and said, "These are used," and handed them back. She remembered her shock at his reaction, and then seriously thought about, would she have given those sneakers to someone in her own family? They were used after all. She spoke about how Mr. Edwards had taught her to give those who need, those people living in poverty, things that are new. Next person who spoke was the Baptist minister, a wonderful man. He talked about how as he was leaving the building, he would frequently meet Mr. Edwards panhandling at the door, for that was one of his favorite occupations, one that the facility greatly tried to discourage. We fed him, we really clothed him, he had a place to sleep. Why did he need to panhandle? Well, he knew why he needed it. He needed the money to buy cigarettes. which he wasn't supposed to be smoking in the first place. But as he would leave the building each day, Reverend A would say to Mr. Edwards, "Good night," and Mr. Edwards said, "Rev, got any spare change?" One day, Reverend A just had had enough. He stopped and said to Mr. Edwards, "Can you ever say, 'Rev, how are you? How was your day? How are things going?' All you ever say to me is, 'Do you have any spare change?'" The next day, as Reverend A was leaving, Mr. Edwards said to him, "Hey, Rev, how was your day? Did you have a good day?" And then looked him straight in the eye and said, "Do you have any change?" As the Reverend told the story, he started to laugh at himself and his own need to be recognized, his own need to be taken care of by those that he was supposed to be caring for. The next person who stood up was the COO of the facility, someone who had frustrated the rest of us because each day as he left the building, he had given our panhandling resident $1. As he stood up, he said, "You know, I used to think of that as my toll. The toll that I paid each day to get into the garage and go home, because I could go home while the residents had to stay." And then I stood. I was the vice president for mission. I should have known better, but on Sundays when I would have to work as the administrator on call, I frequently helped people get ready for Mass and helped them transport residents from the elevator. When I would be there on a Sunday, there'd be many volunteers, but there'd also be Mr. Edwards, helping to lift the wheelchairs a little bit, those that were caught getting off the elevator. At the end of his service, he would put out his hand and one of the volunteers would give him a few dollars. Whenever I was there at the end of his service, I would say, "Thank you, Mr. Edwards, for volunteering." And then finally one day, as I finished my little "Thank you, Mr. Edwards, for volunteering," he turned to me and said, "Thank you, sister, for volunteering." And I realized that I really wasn't volunteering. I was doing this on a day that was my usual work day. I'd get another day off in payment for what I had done. And yet I was so conscious that Mr. Edwards should be a volunteer and not be paid his $2. Mr. Edwards taught us all much. As we shared those stories at his memorial service, each of us realized that he had touched us. He had changed us. He changed the way we thought about ourselves and the way we thought about people who were poor. He changed attitudes and hearts. But what changed us even more was this group gathered in the chapel, sharing these stories together. For we were telling each other of our weakness, how we were not perfect servants of the poor, the mistakes we had made, and what we had learned from those whom we served. We truly were being evangelized.